Well, hey, friends, glad you're joining us this evening as we take up yet another week of our study of cities of the biblical world. First couple of weeks, we talked about Rome and we talked about Jerusalem. And this week, we're going to talk about Corinth. As far as early centers of Christianity go, Corinth is one of the largest and one of the earliest, right behind Jerusalem and places in Palestine as it begins to spread. And one of fairly significant importance. And so I think it's important that we take the time to take a look at the city of Corinth and learn a little bit more about it. They're on the receiving end of multiple letters from Paul, two of which we have, but others of which are referred to that we don't. First Corinthians, our First Corinthians has a verse that says, "In my previous letter," which means there's at least one MIA and likely, very likely more than that. It's a place that Paul spent a year and a half doing mission work. And so obviously a place that was of importance in his ministry. So we'll talk a little bit about its history, give you a little bit more background and maybe a little bit more information to help shape your own studies and reading of those two letters and of some of the book of Acts that tells of Paul's time there. So we'll get started. Corinth is an ancient Greek city. It's a place that had been inhabited before Rome was, reaching well back into the same time as like King David over on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. There's already a growing population of some people in this area. It is an incredibly important area. All north-south traffic through Greece has to go through Corinth. It is a place, if you look at a map of Greece, on this narrow strip of land before the Peloponnesian Peninsula, Corinth kind of sits right there. So from sea to sea on either side of Corinth, the distance of the land between those 2 points is 3.9 miles wide. And so any sort of commerce and trade in ancient Greece absolutely had to go through Corinth. So it is an incredibly prosperous city in the ancient world. It does well. It's well positioned. It has, ports on either side of land for shipping coming from both directions. And this prosperity and this ever-turning population has some significant impact on the culture of Corinth. Corinth was definitely known as, what's the nice way to say this? Corinth was known as a sexually permissive city in the ancient world. Now, as to how accurate the descriptions of Corinth are, there is some debate. Strabo writes that at one point, the temple of Aphrodite in ancient Corinth had 1,000 prostitutes. That is most certainly overstatement, but overstatement exists for a reason. It's one of those where there's smoke, there's fire kind of situations. There are other ancient writers that talk about the promiscuity that is present in Corinth all along the way. There are even words invented to describe sexually promiscuous individual. That is it's kind of a borrow word. It's a combination word that takes one Greek word and attaches it to the word Corinth. It's Corinthias ethei, which means to act like a Corinthian, and is used to connotate sleeping around or constantly going to visit prostitutes. So that tells you a little bit about what Corinth was like in the ancient world. By the time we get to the Corinth of Paul's day, while there's some similarities there, and we'll talk about those in a minute, what we were really talking about is a brand new city. The Roman legions destroy Corinth in 160-something BC, and for more than 100 years, it sits empty in ruins. And it is in the 40s BC, around the same time that like Herod the Great comes to power in Israel. that the empire, the Roman Empire, rebuilds Corinth. They use it as a massive port city. Um, they refurbish this portage, which is a way of moving ships out of the water from one bay to the other, which saves you this much longer and much more dangerous trip all the way around the peninsula to get to the other side. They repopulate it with retiring Roman soldiers. They give it colony status, which means to be standing in Corinth is treated as if you were standing in Rome. It is this high honor that very few places get. It has significant meaning for Roman legal status. If you pay attention to cities of importance in the Roman Empire, there are only two that are deemed more important than Corinth during Paul's day, and that is Alexandria in Egypt and Rome in Rome. That's it. So it goes Rome, Alexandria, Corinth as far as places of importance. They hosted these massive athletic games every other year, second only to the Olympic Games. And so when Paul uses race running imagery in 1 Corinthians 9, he's not doing so generically. He's doing so because his audience, who's on the receiving end of this letter, would every other year be watching these athletes compete. And he literally describes what is the word? Unfading. There we go. All athletes are disciplined. So this is 925. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win the prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. The prize that will fade away was literally the wreath, the laurel, the crown that winners were given, which was woven out of already dying celery plants. He's talking about the difference between the perishable and the non-perishable, what lasts and what doesn't. And he uses like images from their daily life. It is also obvious in 1 Corinthians 5 that the sexual promiscuity and permissiveness that existed in Corinth in the ancient time was still present in the modern. That's not surprising given that it is a major port city with people coming through from all over the world and a reputation that it continued to hold even while it sat in destruction, and certainly as it rebuilt. Those temple practices from Greece had not gone away under Rome. In some cases, they were amplified. And so Corinth continues to be a place where prostitution is rampant. Of course, it carries Greek pederasty tradition. All of those things are still very much a part of Greek society in the Roman world. And so I think of Corinth every time I hear somebody talk about how terribly promiscuous and permissive our world is, because we ain't got nothing on ancient Corinth. We just don't. You see like Corinthians 5, 1 Corinthians 5, when they're having to deal with a son, father, wife situation, and the comment that they're proud of it says something about the city and about the culture that they were raised in. This is not an old church. We're not talking about people with decades and decades and decades of Christian tradition. We're talking about a young church made up of people whose backgrounds had been in these temples and whose civic and cultural responsibility in their workplaces still involves temple life. If you want to read for you historical fiction readers, there's this guy named Ben Witherington. He's a professor of theology at, I want to say he's at Asbury Theological Seminary. He's a very talented writer, and he writes New Testament based historical fiction. And he's got a book called A Week in the Life of Corinth that I strongly recommend you read. I've got a digital copy of it that I love. And he uses Corinth's historical setting to fill in cultural life information about Corinth for us, the reader. And I think it's a really good book to help us build some background and understanding of what life is like. Um, we know from um, the book of Romans and from the book of Acts, from the book of Romans and from the book of Acts, of some members of the Corinth church, Prisca and Aquila being two important ones. Acts 18 contains the story of some of Paul's time in Rome. If you want to, or in Rome, in Corinth, if you want to do some reading there, Aquila and Prisca are people that he stumbles into who have been kicked out of Rome by Claudius, which you may remember me talking about 2 weeks ago, who end up in Corinth and ply their trade there and begin doing missionary work, spreading the gospel in Corinth. So Acts 18 is a great place for you to look there. One of the things that happens in Acts 18 that becomes incredibly important to early Christianity, that if you don't know Roman legal system, you breeze past without recognizing its significance. In the end of chapter 18 of Acts, we get the story of some synagogue people who for 18 months have been putting up with Paul's teaching in their synagogues and recruiting of their members. And they've had enough, and a new leader comes to power in the region. Now, again, I've already mentioned how incredibly important Corinth is. So this person is an incredibly important leader in Rome, and their legal decisions set precedent for a large area. This is like a person with significant influence in how a large region of the Roman Empire is going to be governed. And so these Jewish leaders in the synagogue who are tired of Paul's recruitment and we call it ministry. They probably did not think of it quite as kindly as we do. To their synagogue members, take this issue up. And they take it to this governor and they plead their case in front of him. And before Paul even bothers with the defense, he dismisses the whole thing, saying that this sounds like a Jewish religious conversation, and so it's theirs to figure out. Now, here's what that means. What he essentially does is provide early Christianity the same legal protections that Judaism already had in the Roman world. If he had seen it as something different, as something foreign, he has to approach it in a very different way. But because he sees that it and Judaism are the same thread, the same group, the same block, what he essentially does is afford it legal protection for the foreseeable future, and at the very least for as long as he is the one in charge in this region, which ends up being for a fairly substantial amount of time. And so that's one of those verses in Acts that if you don't have a huge understanding of what's going on, how the legal world works, or understand Corinth's importance and therefore this individual leader's importance in the Roman world, you kind of breeze on by and you focus more on the fact that they beat the synagogue leader Sosthenes in the middle of the room, and this guy just kind of raises his nose up and looks the other way. But if you understand what that means, what you see here is this legal protection that is extended to early Christianity in a way that ultimately helps. Even though sometimes we think about the way that forces in the empire work against Christianity, often overstated. Persecution didn't exist on the level that we've often talked about it. Even still, what we see here is legal protections extended to and granted to early Christianity in the same vein as what had been extended to Judaism, which is a big deal. Corinth is an incredibly wealthy city, but that wealth is isolated in the hands of 5% of the population, and it's built in a relatively small amount of space. And so, if you're one of the people who have gotten incredibly wealthy, you have these nice villas, outside and around town and on the hills that overlook Corinth. But the town of Corinth itself is incredibly densely populated. estimates of population of Corinth from this time period come in right around 50,000 people. But those 50,000 people lived in an incredibly tight space. So Corinth has a population density of 137 on the low end to over 200 people per acre. To give you a comparison, Spokane's population density when measured in people per acre is 5. So you can understand how tightly populated that area is. And we have the benefits of a modern sewer system. In Corinth, the street was the sewer system. Chamber buckets, pots, got dumped out into the streets. 137 people per acre is roughly the same density as Manhattan, the borough of Manhattan. And 200 people per acre, if you take the high end, is far more dense than the island of Manhattan. Of course, these people are packed into even smaller homes in smaller spaces on smaller streets. So you get an idea that Corinth is just, it is a game of sardines living in Corinth. But the benefit to that is that you are in regular contact with people from all over the world. You've got the 2 ports coming in on either side of the city. You've got the main north-south thoroughfare through Greece, and therefore one of the most important north-south or east, one of the most important thoroughfares in the world. Moving through the middle of Corinth, people come in and out from all over the world. I think the reason that Paul sets up in Corinth and not in Athens, even though Athens historically would be considered a much more important place, is because Corinth provides Paul access to people coming and going in a way that Athens simply does not. And so Paul sees it well worth his time to stay there, to teach, to build up this church and inform it, because he understands that it's going to play an important role in the growth and in the spread of early Christianity. All right. I try not to make sure I don't leave anything out, but also trying to work a little more quickly tonight than I have the last 2 weeks so that I actually keep my word when I tell you that I'm trying not to make these overly long. I think all of that provides a good background for reading the letters to the Corinthians and to and of Paul's time in Corinth in Rome. One thing we do know with relative certainty from Romans 16 is that Paul made some inroads with some incredibly wealthy people in Corinth, including a guy who's like the city treasurer in the end. We actually have that note in Romans 16 and find the same name inscribed in stone from around the same time period in Corinth. Very likely, it would seem, the same person. It's one of those little historical connections for the story of Christianity outside the Bible and in archaeology. But what that means is you have this massive divide between some very well-off, very wealthy people in the church in Corinth and then the rest of the masses, the people who are not, the ones who are making that 200 people per acre density a reality, which is not a pleasant experience. And so the church in Corinth has issues blending together those with wealth and those that don't, which is why Paul has to deal with some issues with how they do communion. In the early church, communion was part of a larger meal, and you've got the wealthy people who have other people work for them that are able to show up and treat the communion meal as a leisurely experience that is somewhat akin to a Greek temple ritual where they're getting drunk the same way they would have at a guild dinner inside the temple to Apollo, the same way they had done inside the temple to Apollo at a guild dinner maybe 3 weeks before. And you've got others that are having to work in order to survive, and so they're not able to make it until later. And so you've got food and communion that are gone by the time the rest of the church is getting there. What do you do with that? Well, that's a unique situation to the church in Corinth. All right, I think that covers everything. I wanted to be sure to hit that. Yeah, I hope you all are enjoying these videos as we start dealing with places like Corinth and Ephesus and Philippi. We get a little more tangible because we have both the stories of Acts and the writings of Paul to help build that out a little bit. And then we get into some good archaeology as well. Next week, I will try to have some more like pictures up, even if it's just me holding them up to the screen and trying to get them to focus so that you can get some visual. For tonight, I'm sorry, what you got as visual is the mess on the bookshelves behind me. All right, glad that you were able to join us. We'll be back at it again next week. Thanks, y'all.